Welcome to episode 5 of Deciphering Software Modernisation. I'm Sam, software craftsperson.
I'm Abdul, a delivery manager at Codurance.
Maciej, software craftsperson, Codurance.
Excellent. Intros out the way, and onwards we go. So today, we wanted to talk about managing fear within a software modernization project, and in particular, how you can justify our work, software modernization, to stakeholders and the importance of that. So to start us off, I wanted to put a question to you both, which is, well, why is it important to justify a software modernization project and the work to the stakeholders?
I think from my side, I will go back to like comparison maybe to other two types of project, which is like a greenfield or a brownfield, let's say, or a maintenance project, right? So for a greenfield, again, it's very clear, right, what's the business requests from you, basically. Maybe you don't know how you're going to do it, how you're going to implement it, but from the business, from the stakeholder, it's usually quite clear, or at least the initial foundations for the work are quite clear. For like a brownfield project, again, it's pretty well established, usually, right? And there is sometimes even just some SLAs that need to be met. So it's quite clear, like what needs to be done. Just make sure everything is still going fine, and whatever feature needs to be added, it's still added on top of existing systems and with the well-established ways and strategies of working with that system, I guess. And in terms of modernization, I guess it's always a lot of those question marks in the heads of stakeholders. What actually would that mean? Like, how much would it cost? Like, what I would get from that, I guess. So it's important to have prepare for that, let's say, which I guess we'll be discussing today, and continue reaffirming the stakeholders that what you're doing is has a very certain ROI for them in certain points, basically. So I guess we'll uncover that today. So, but it's very important compared to those other projects.
I think it's very hard to commercially justify modernization projects simply because they don't have a commercial bent to them. They're mostly around improving things like delivery velocity, the maybe uptime, your quality of your software. So I think it's very difficult to put that ROI on it and see, what's the long-term return for this. That's obviously something you have to work on. I think the other factor, I guess, moving maybe more towards the fear portion, is also that when we talk about modernization, we are often talking about touching existing functionality that works for the business, right? So there's a very justifiable reason why a business may be hesitant to change what already works. It may have had to go through a process of a quite painful process potentially to get it working. So not only do you have the fact that it can be a bit difficult to justify financially, and you have to kind of look at it more abstractly around the cost of delay and things like that, but you also have then the aspect of, are you going to change the software and potentially make it worse, which is a fear from the business side, which realistically has to be addressed in order to get the confidence to move forward initially and to continue moving forward.
So there is the fear on the business side of things, on stakeholder side of things, but it is also fear on the product development side of things. So existing engineers, existing teams, and again, if there's a greenfield project, okay, we know it's acknowledged that we're working on something completely new, and okay, that's fine. With like brownfield, and mostly this is where modernization will be happening. They're used to their ways of working. They're used to their usually waterfall process. They are used to siloing. They're used to all this stuff, and they are used to old technologies as well. And with this modernization thing on the side, well, maybe not at the beginning, but soon they start to realize they need to start adopting to this new ways of working, and that may be bringing fear into the table on the product development side as well, which the software modernization team should also manage and should strive to reduce as much as possible. That's in the end is good for the business, and it's good for the engineers as well in the long run.
So it'd be fair to say that fear comes in from many different directions, and if you're working in software modernization, you're going to have to manage that as well. Because one thing that was touched on as well is for the main team working on software modernization, they're going to have potentially some fear. What do you think in terms of ways to minimize that? And what I'm thinking here is more along the lines of one source of fear could be we lack domain knowledge within our team, because maybe you've moved from one part of the company to another, or this is a completely fresh team into the company that are solving a particular problem, and they simply don't have the domain knowledge at that moment in time.
I think from my perspective, first of all, I think it's really important to acknowledge that fear is a good emotion. Fear is an important emotion. If you're at the edge of a precipice, then it's probably good to be afraid. And I think we need to use that fear insofar as it helps us identify what we might be missing. Okay, so if you're afraid, as an example, as you said, that we don't really understand the domain, then that's an indicator that we need to engage those domain experts. We need to get the business involved. One of the activities I like to do when we're involved in kind of projects like this is to sit down with all the naysayers and start jotting down everything they say is going to be a problem. Oh, well, we don't have the test coverage, so testing's an issue. Oh, well, we've never touched that software for 10 years. Software knowledge and potentially a bit of domain knowledge is also an issue. And that gives you a really good strike list of things that need to be addressed. Now, will you manage to address all of those things up front? Probably not. They'll have to be prioritized, and some of it will be risks that have to potentially be accepted, and there will be that balancing act. But I think it's very important to acknowledge that the fear is important, and that one of the ways I prefer to manage it is to be proactive and look into where's that fear coming from, what are the things that potentially we haven't thought about, and proactively and consciously identify those so that we can manage that risk proactively rather than trying to minify it and potentially find that later on it kind of bites you, because this fear does come from somewhere, and usually it's experience.
There's this famous book, This Heart of Change, basically, which it's not particularly about IT modernization change, but in general transformation. And like the first step is create a sense of urgency. So I guess it relates a bit to the fear aspect, but it's not to like instill fear, but just enough fear, which then should transform into something positive, and that's a call to action in some way. But there should be something, not just maybe like some slides, graphics, and like basic metrics, but something that goes a bit deeper on the emotional level. That's actually, if we won't start modernizing this thing, we may be way behind our competitors like down the line, and you don't need like very flashy graphics about it in the end, right? But creating like sense of urgency, but again, it's like in the end, making it like a call to action rather than a constant fear that you instill in your stakeholders and engineers. So.
And that's a really good point, actually. I think that's where the balance comes in, right? Because you've got that call to action or burning platform that is pushing and driving you forward, and that's what will allow you, I think, in many ways to accept risk as well. So if you look at your spectrum of risk, there are things that you absolutely must take care of, but there will be other items that potentially are not worth investment and overcoming, because the risk of essentially not getting out early and getting your software modernized or in a state that is competitive would potentially undermine what we're trying to achieve, whether it be making software that's competitive with the market, or potentially overcoming some severe issues with the software that's making it unusable potentially for clients or customers. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's just like it's two forces you have to play with.
I guess you can show some graphs and again that kind of stuff, but again, it's like what the author in that book like shows an example, which is a great one, right? So there were a lot of times like they were trying to like create that sense of urgency and like start a transformation, but they were showing a lot of graphs, a lot of like statistics, what the clients are, what the feedback of the clients is, and it just didn't resonate enough. And they decided just to record one of the clients that came into the branch. He decided, okay, that's fine, you can record me. And he was like very emotional as how was expressing his like feedback and stuff. And just this one video made a whole change actually to make the stakeholders and the business, okay, we need to do something about it instead of those graphs and flashy things, that we want to do to present, but something that works like on an emotional level. That's quite important. So.
And then there's also outside factors as well that maybe you start seeing your competition is being able to innovate faster, etc. And so you're sort of like, oh, we're playing catch up. So you sort of have that impetus to be like, well, we need to make some changes. It can come from different angles. One thing you touched on as well at the beginning, Matt, was the fact that justification of your work isn't something you just do at the beginning, but it's a continual thing throughout the work, because you're fine justifying it at the beginning, and your stakeholder buys in, but you need to continually justify the work, and I think that keeps teams honest as well. Are we going towards that goal? Are we going towards that goal? Oh no, this actually isn't going to take us towards that goal. Let's pivot. So yeah, I think it makes sense. One thing I was thinking about with you when you said that was, I was thinking about opportunities created by the team throughout the process where you can justify your work to stakeholders. And one thing that cropped up was demonstrations, sprint demonstrations. If you're working sprints or whatever, some form of demo, however you're working. And the importance of demos. What's your views, both of you, on the importance of demonstrations, particularly in software modernization projects?
I think demos are really key. I think they're really key a little bit outside just taking a bit back from modernization. They're key in any iterative process because they're how you build confidence. So if you think about a traditional project plan, it gives stakeholders a sense of control because they can see within that plan, this is everything you will do, and this is where you are at every stage. And that's what gives them the confidence that you will get to where you need to be. Obviously, within an iterative project, we want to, prioritize work, deliver an increment of work, and then move on to the next iteration. Now, that is, as anyone who's run an agile project with a traditional PMO knows, it's very hard to get confidence on, and understandably, because they feel they can't necessarily see what's going on, right? There's a question mark of, okay, but what will you be doing in a month's time? I think demos are key to getting the confidence that a self-organizing team works, right? So that the team are able to work with stakeholders to correctly identify the priorities for an iteration of work, and are able to deliver working software that adds value. And that's how you then build that confidence that says, look, let me do another iteration and another iteration, and keep building that confidence over time. With modernization, that's particularly important because there can be a lot of concern that you're not really moving. One of the tricks, I think, is to change it around a little bit and prove that, look, we've modernized it and the behavior hasn't changed. So you rather than showcasing change, is showcasing lack of change, for lack of a better term, so that you've got this maybe newfangled cloud software with the distributed architecture, but the front end still looks the same. Everything still works the same, and that I think it's hugely important to building confidence around. When you get to the point of releasing your software, that everyone feels comfortable with what you've done.
That's actually a very interesting point because, like on a greenfield project and even brownfield, it's like those stakeholders expect, okay, what's new? What's new? I can see. It's actually here. Like, I don't want to see anything changing. Like in the end, right? It's in terms of me saying things. I guess if you show the UI, so that's quite an interesting thing about software modernization. So I'm going to talk about maybe like the layers of demos, possibly, because there are many ways you can do it and many places you can be doing it as well. And I think you should be doing it even regardless if it's a modernization project or not. So obviously, like Abdul mentioned, the stakeholder demos, obviously every sprint, that's what should always be happening, ideally. But also on a bit within the team, I think what used to work well is at least once a week or ideally twice a week, have sort of a team catch up where ideally if we're working in pairs, each pair is presenting their work to the team. So that's 2, 3, 4 times a sprint. There's that internal feedback exchange and everyone knows what everyone else is working on and gives each other feedback as well. And obviously it can be more a technical side. There's no stakeholder in there, so we can be more technical, right? On the technical side of things, additionally, and I think that's okay. So this one is maybe specifically for a modernization project where actually eventually the goal of your work is to hand over your deliverables to the product development teams and start them adopting those best practices and ways of working, new technology stack and all that stuff. And What I saw works really well is also at least once a sprint have some sort of a technical catch-up with the teams or a team who would be the direct like receiver and consumer of those deliverables, and go in deep in terms of the technical stuff, because usually it will be for developers, maybe some QA people, and there may be a business analyst as well, but it's good to keep it technical as well, so that first you get feedback about like the domain language that you're using, and I guess we're going to get to EDD at some point as well, but also so that this product team is slowly started to get accustomed to the way that you're doing things in a modernized way, which will be usually completely different than the old way. And instead of just handing it over like this huge deliverable at the end to them and, you know, here it is, good luck. No, actually, we are taking you on a journey, iterative journey, and showing you how this works so that when the handover happens, you at least on a foundational level, like fine to start working with it, right? So we have the stakeholder demos, we have the internal team kind of demos, we have the technical demos with the team who'd be consuming your modernization work, and finally I would go like mile above everything and have this like monthly or at least quarterly updates to like C-level people, like senior architects, where you do a proper executive summary of the modernization work, because usually it will be more than one team working on various modernization activities. And then you just want to show how the progress goes, what's the roadmap, how the teams work in unison, and how the adoption of the product development team happens of those modernization practices. So that's my few cents about demos.
And it makes sense as well, because that they're having it multi-layered as well, because each audience is potentially going to want something a little bit different. Like you mentioned, those sort of monthly or quarterly updates. That audience is not going to want the level of detail that you're potentially going to do on a sprint demo or the technical walkthroughs, and you're going to sort of be answering different questions. So it makes perfect sense. But as you said, each sort of level is needed, because you can justify the work to technical individuals within say the domain, or you can do it within the sort of maybe initial stakeholders. But if you're not also justifying it to then the people, then as you said, sort of maybe a mile above, then there's a danger there to the project, right? At each layer they need to see the value of the work, and that in itself is a skill on many different levels. One thing I wanted to touch on was sort of the idea that we do demos, of course, but do you think that there's other things that are important to sort of create? Because you mentioned before, Mac, about the potentially you could have this silo situation where maybe it's possible you could work in isolation, but that you mentioned the importance of working with, say, the product teams, etc. What do you feel that can be done to create that synergy, and sort of, because what you're describing was sort of validation. You're validating, are you using the correct domain terms, validating the approach to some degree as well, because you have people there that maybe say, oh, this is what we're working on the product this quarter, so you can see, does it align with what they're working on? Are there going to be any potential treading on toes and that sort of thing? So what sort of techniques do you guys suggest that can sort of help bridge that gap and create that synergy between those sort of two functions?
My general approach is to try and make the modernization team or project team cross-functional. Simple as that. So I think you need at least a lot of time, if not full time, one or two members from the product team. I would prefer a technical SME and someone from quality or product side of it, or technical product side of it, someone who understands how it works. And I think there are other activities you can do, obviously, like your demo and catch-ups and things like that, but they often don't have the intimacy of the touch points necessary to really have an impact on what you're doing and making sure you're in touch with what's already there. So I think it's really important that you have someone assigned to the team who can sit with individuals and talk through, why something is the way it is. And from a quality perspective, a QA, they can often look at and tell you a lot about the domain itself and how the domain relates to software as well, which I think is something we kind of touched on, but I think it's an important thing to highlight. You can talk about a domain in very abstract terms and how the business works, but how does that actually translate to the screens? How does that translate to the forms? Right? You often find that anyone who's involved in testing these things regularly are more in tune with the requirements than anyone else in the organization. So for me, it's just about, you might have a core of individuals that are your modernization team, but seed it with SMEs from the product side of it that can help you understand the context better and build, relevant safety nets within your modernization project.
That's a very interesting point. So what can I add on top of that is, in terms of siloing, maybe let's talk about like siloing maybe within the modernization effort itself, right? Because the whole point is to actually promote ways of working that are exact opposite of siloing. But of course, like naturally within the modernization effort, there are many teams, also some siloing may happen. So that is a disaster, right? Because what they're trying to promote is actually happening within kind of their endeavor, right? In the end. So what I saw works really well in the end. As the point of modernizing, obviously there are those like core initiatives that are aligned with the stakeholders that those teams need to work on, but like it is expected from each of the teams to like have this innovation seeking mindset. And it's fine that you could have, so for example, what work, like from my experience, is to have like a common backlog for entire modernization efforts for all the teams, common backlog for like innovation seeking across development improvement, across test automation improvements, in terms of creating some new pipelines around SRE, some innovative ideas, and whoever comes up with some ideas, just put it on that common collaborative boards in there, so that everyone can see it, everyone can contribute. And if those items are worked upon, they are worked like in pairs across the modernization teams. So that breaks silos really well and promotes knowledge sharing as well. And in terms of knowledge sharing, right, so besides of the innovation seeking, there's also the knowledge sharing with the product teams. That's the responsibility of the modernization teams. You have to make sure that this also is a shared collaborative efforts within the modernization endeavor, basically, in the end. So again, you can have a backlog for seminars that, you talk to some senior engineers, to some mentors, to architects, and you can hear those common problems, those hot topics, I call them, basically. I know there are some memory leaks problems currently, or the way that transaction management is done completely different in various areas of the system. And those topics that maybe that you can spin up a seminar or a bunch of seminars and just keep a backlog of that. So again, that ownership of these is shared between the modernization teams as well. So that's kind of my 2 cents on siloing. That's what the modernization teams are preaching about, but also they need to think about their own anti-siloing methods as well. So,
and a lot of the stuff that they're going to share, like for instance, team A maybe have solved one way to do something, and then maybe team B, maybe a couple of months later, they actually run into the same problem. And so because they're constantly sharing, they already have one known solution that will work there as well. So it's just important to sort of share those tools amongst everyone. So yeah, as well as obviously, as you said, the product teams as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also regarding, as this is about managing fear. So this is reducing the fear within the modernization effort as well, right? Which is important. Like modernization is there to reduce the fear of change with the organization, but also there's initially, especially a lot of fear within the modernization projects. What are we doing is actually make sense? Are we getting somewhere? And those like success stories and sharing all those, moving forward is important within the modernization effort.
Which actually the demos, for instance, can be a great place to also share that as well. They can be one place to share, like, this was this was a problem or is a problem, and here's a solution as well. I think it's important as well for stakeholders, again at different levels, to really see that as well, to see this is a problem, they have found a solution as well. And it's not just here's a problem, okay, great. you want to find those solutions as well. And also one thing I find interesting is, I think we sort of somewhat covered it in one of the earlier episodes, is the value you can really deliver in those demos as well. Like you can say, oh, here's a problem, but you can say, well, and here's the solution as well. And even just the sharing of that solution. I don't mean actually just, I'm ignoring the implementation for that. I mean, even just the sharing of the solution in itself can be extremely valuable, because then you shared that with maybe people from the product team, stakeholders, and that knowledge just in that one session has started to spread. And so that's extremely valuable as well. And this is even ignoring some of the findings, like, we analyzed it and we found a performance bottleneck here or whatever, this is, those other good stuff can come as well.
So basically, sorry, I'm taking a bit of airtime here, but something came to my mind. Actually, it's very important that the modernization teams there share those success stories, like through those demos and direct work with the product teams. But from what I found is like magnifies exponentially, or actually, sorry, like even reduces exponentially the fear within organization, are the success stories of product teams adopting those modernization practices and then showing how they succeeded after they adopted them, how those metrics, I don't know, lead time or change failure rates, or because like architectural quality attributes like performance, scalability, all those things improve thanks to adopting those practices. And it's important for modernization teams to get those product team success stories onto those demos, because it's a lot better to allow them to show the benefits rather than the modernization teams, which obviously initially that would be the case, but with time, you have more and more of those success stories, and they should be the hallmark of your demos in some way. So if possible.
And I think that's a really good point. I mean, one thing that's cropped to mind as you're saying all that is, especially change projects, but I'd say most projects, they have a momentum to them. Change projects, especially because they're having to overcome the inertia in the organization. And by doing that sharing, by getting that confidence, by getting that constant feedback and succeeding essentially in frequent increments, you can really build and maintain that momentum in an upwards trajectory, which is absolutely key. I think sometimes some of the mistakes I've seen often is that, teams are afraid to share. They don't want to talk about what they've done, and they want to wait until it's perfect. But the momentum slowly dies, and people become less enthusiastic about what you're doing. And by the time you present, there can be a lot of resistance to what you're talking about, because you haven't warmed them up to it. Essentially, it's all been just dropped at an instance. So it's a really good point. I think it's important just to keep that project going, making sure you can get it across the line.
Yeah, and I think like on top of the like momentum building, it's very important for modernization teams to like make sure that like all this adoption, like after some of the adoption effort, there are some success stories, so that the organization does not get like complacent. Okay, like we know how to do those things. It's like you can try to do something else, but actually it's only just a handful of teams maybe that adopted it. There's still entire iceberg like underneath still to go. So that's initial complacency after those initial successes is something to watch out for, because it can like slow down the momentum, because there's still a long way to go, right? So that's a very important responsibility of the modernization team, to keep the momentum going and make sure that those success stories are not like the end, right? That's just the beginning, let's say, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. And as you said, they continue to happen throughout, but it's not like a terminal thing of great success story, right? All done. Pack your bags. But no, I mean, absolutely. Well, one thing I was thinking about actually, just to take this back a little bit to sort of more the beginning, early stages. I was thinking one of the techniques I've seen in the past that work really well is when, say, you have a software modernization team and they're dealing with a product. And there's maybe this fear around this product, but up until this point, maybe you've only heard people talk about the product, and maybe they've described it and say, oh, it's this big and this blah blah blah, and maybe they create like this this sort of mystique around this product, is actually just to start trying to get it set up and running, and start some exploratory, just go through a few of the user journeys, have a play around with it, see how it works, look at the code under the hood. I found that can be one sort of, yeah, I say easy because even setting up the product sometimes can be a bit of a mission, but like that can be a reasonably low cost way to start getting used to the thing that you're going to be working with, etc., and sort of reduce some of that fear, because you start looking at, oh yeah, see how it works, etc., etc. And you could start joining the dots, and actually see it rather than it just being something that's talked about, which maybe will happen in the earlier stages. Is there might be lots of discussion around the product, but you may not actually see it and actually start playing around with it. So yeah, I don't know, what do you guys think about that sort of more like not about exploratory testing, but just sort of exploration and getting it up and running? What do you guys think about that?
One thing that I think can be really useful, I mean, depends on where you are. So we've spoken before about sprint zeros. I think sprint zeros are useful when you've got some understanding. Like you can basically within 2 weeks get a degree of confidence about the system, and you can start really working with it. I think there are instances where something might be so arcane that you don't even know whether it's what you're talking about is even remotely possible. At which point I think a POC makes a lot of sense, right? Let's take a month or two and let's do it in the dirtiest way possible. Let's just prove whether it's possible from a very rudimentary perspective. Obviously, you have to be very clear up front. This is not productionized. This is just proving that the concept is possible. And I think what that can do is, obviously there's always the detail, but if you can just prove that at the very highest level it can work, then that gives you the confidence. Then when you actually start looking at how would you do this in practice, to be able to do it more practically. I'd always look to time box it, and I'd always want a team mature enough to understand what a POC really should be, exactly how dirty it really needs to be. But then, as you say, it kind of overcomes that. You really then worked with it, and this is especially important in things like cloud migrations, where you're completely changing the paradigm. Right, you're not just kind of working within the context of its existing ecosystem. You're probably completely changing maybe even the technologies that assemble the software, and that can have a whole host of problems that just make the whole thing potentially unfeasible. And that's where I think it's really important. Just POC it. Let's see if this is even possible before you really commit to a long-term investment. And I think that can also give stakeholders as well, and technical stakeholders as well, more confidence around what you're trying to do, because they can see it. They can see it's actually being done.
It kind of relates a little bit back to what we had said in a previous discussion around sort of it's all one big experiment, really. And even when you have something more concrete, it's still to a degree an experiment. But yeah, that idea of trying something, time boxing it, does it take us? Do we think it's going to take us to where we want to get to, etc.? Can help allay fear, because you can talk about something forever, but actually getting into the reads and actually working your way through can be super useful in a way to sort of say, well, actually, it's not as bad as we thought. This thing we thought was going to be really bad. Experiment, not so bad. Fear reduced.
And like in terms of like fear, so where is it? So modernization teams comes in, and also there's a lot of fear on the product development side, because they have like no idea how to touch any of this. They don't want to touch this, and it's like intrinsically part of the modernization team to take that fear onto themselves at the beginning, especially, right? So, okay, we take that on ourselves. We do that POC, and we try to create something like on top of that legacy system, like state of the art, but on top of the legacy system. And we can show you how to do it, and how iteratively, eventually, the whole system should be state of the art. And is that like intrinsic nature of the modernization team, that they are taking that fear from the development teams? You can focus on your development for now. The old ways of working will show you how to gradually start modernizing, and in a safe way, because also besides of the pure modernized workflows, we also show you how to have a very comprehensive test suites around it, and how to get feedback from some pipelines and DevOps ideas as well. So that's something to think about, right? It's like the modernization team, they should, like at any given point in time, they are the ones taking that fear on them, and then showing it's not as bad, and then reducing that fear through the experience and their deliverables onto the product development teams and the stakeholders eventually as well.
There's a good point, especially when you said about the software, and what kind of propped to my mind as well was also not trying to take on too much, right? With any context, there will be you are looking at MVP, and it doesn't mean that you have to touch all the software all at once. There are something I'm not too keen on is sometimes people look at modernization or replatforming as this massive big bang project, like we will have to refactor the whole thing. And I think that is naturally terrifying because it is a very dangerous thing to do. Reality is you shouldn't have to touch everything. You can prioritize what you want to touch, what you want to modernize first, what is necessary to modernize immediately, and what probably could be done at a later date. And I think in that way, contextualizing it and taking it step by step and approaching that problem, little by little, makes it much more consumable, much more easier for everyone, whether it be the developer, whether it be a product team, whether it be the modernization team, to kind of get their head around, rather than say, okay, we've got to refactor 20,000 classes or something insane.
Especially that's in the end, like the modernization effort would be a very tiny effort compared to the product development usually, let's say. Because we're talking about medium to large size organizations that have established systems, usually, right? So, and that's, the modernization teams can do like only so much. They're maybe like 10, 15% of the resourcing of the product development in the end. So eventually it's the product development that should be the scalability aspects in terms of the modernization, right? So modernization teams are there to create the blueprints and figure out those POCs and show the way. But eventually, like the full transformation will not happen without those product teams. So it's very important to incrementally reduce that fear, right? So that they keep adopting more and more of these practices and get more comfortable with, because that will eventually bring like the system to the state-of-the-art form, where the modernization teams are this initial trigger spark passing over the torch, right? So
it's something you mentioned, Mac, around the fact that you have to continually sort of reduce the fear in the product team and then start adopting these practices, because it can't just be the case that the software modernization team take on all that fear and then the other team allow, well, thank God those guys are doing that. It has to at some point it has to at some point start transitioning over and then start taking portions of it and adopting, as you said, through knowledge sharing, etc., etc. So then it starts to balance out a bit, and it's not so one-sided. Software modernization team are solving all these problems and product team are sort of there like, oh, thank God I'm not there, sort of thing. So it's a really good point.
Well, something we haven't touched on yet, but I think is important is modernization, like any good agile project, should have aspects of emergent design, right? So it isn't an activity where, as Maciej said, the modernization team come completely modernize your system. There's a real aspect of emergent design based on principles and practices and patterns that are adopted by the team that eventually bring the platform in line with what you want. Whether we're talking about strangling from just modernizing the software internal to the runtime, or whether we're talking about extracting that into maybe something like serverless architecture. I guess the challenge with that, from a development perspective, I think it makes it more comfortable talking about emergent design and not tying yourself up front to how this thing will look essentially in detail. But I think it also then presents often a challenge with business stakeholders of saying that it will evolve into something, which often means, again, trying to get that confidence, week by week, that we know what we're doing, it still kind of does what it does. And you're kind of balancing, I guess, then the interests of your business users with what your developers need in order to be confident to work with that system.
Just add on top of that, it's important that once the modernization team takes on that fear and it's like the burden, it's not that it stays forever with them, right? And it's like the product development, okay, we have it all out of our bags, it's like it's on them. No, it's like you can think of it as a cross-functional effort modernization, where modernization teams and product development are this like cross-functional like big team. You might think about it. Basically, that's okay. Initially, the modernization teams, they take on that burden and fear, but like gradually, like Sam mentioned, that's try to turn that gauge more on towards like balancing that. Yeah, because otherwise it just won't happen. It just won't happen. Yeah, so there's something to keep in mind, that that burden needs to be also like shared at some point as well.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today, to be honest, around fear, and I think there's still some areas we can for sure dig into in more detail, especially some of the techniques, which hopefully we'll do in future episodes. I mean, I just want to sort of go through some of my main takeaways from this discussion, which was sort of the continual justification that needs to be done to stakeholders, and again, as Max said near the beginning, there's different levels to that as well. But also, yeah, this continual attention is not only for justification, but also for that sort of, as you said, just to explain in that, the fact that we want to start transitioning this more to the product as well, so they start adopting these practices. So it's that continual attention within software modernization that sort of makes it a success. And if that continual attention isn't done, then that can obviously impact the effectiveness of that endeavor. So yeah, those were the main ones for me from this discussion. Mac and Abdul, I don't know what your main takeaways were.
I guess I might be running on a theme here, but I think yeah, that whole piece around, I guess everything is incremental, right? Everything's iterative, and iteratively giving confidence through your demos at different levels, to your technical stakeholders, to your business stakeholders, to your other, your development peers. Is distributing that responsibility, managing the confidence of those around you in their ability to adopt what you've done. Yeah, just going with that, almost building that framework and that allows you to be incremental. I think that's my primary takeaway. It's running on a theme, I think, over the last few weeks, but it seems to be an important one.
Yeah, so as a software modernization team, like from the very beginning, be ready to take on a lot of fear on your shoulders, but that's fine. You'll figure out the ways to mitigate that through your work, your deliverables, the way you figure out working the legacy codes, and then do not forget to share your findings with the product teams, and then they helping you out in the scalable aspect of bringing those modernizations to life and completely destroying the fear in the end.
What you both said, sort of in my head, I sort of was marrying them up, and it's sort of, yeah, it is like be prepared to take that fear on your shoulders, but then incrementally chip away at that fear, and also find ways to chip away at the fear that maybe the product team or others have as well, or stakeholders. So you're incrementally chipping away at that fear, so people's fear goes down and not up as time goes on. But yeah, that's a super interesting discussion, and there's many more to come for sure. But for everyone watching, feel free to comment and give us your feedback. Thank you to Nikita, who did the reaction video and the Twitter thread as well. That was awesome. I enjoyed watching and reading that. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us. But until next time, it's goodbye, and yeah, enjoy.